20 years. That is how long the all-time record of America's largest power grid stood untouched, 165,563 megawatts, set in the summer of 2006, and never reached again through 2 decades of summers. Until this week, as a once-in-2 decades heat dome pushed heat indices past 110 degrees across the eastern United States, the grid serving 67 million people ran on 2 federal emergency orders. Wholesale power spiked to 60 times its normal price, and demand climbed to the record's doorstep, with the operator paying customers to hold part of it off the meter. Preliminary data says the record has now fallen. And here is the strange part. Summers just as brutal have come and gone since 2006. None of them came close. Something else changed underneath the heat. By the end of this video, you will know what actually broke this record and where the real danger lies. June 25. 5 days before the first triple-digit heat index, the operator of America's largest power grid sends out a system-wide order. Every generator down for maintenance is to be back in service within days. That is not a routine memo, that is a grid clearing the decks. The grid is PJM Interconnection, the machine coordinating electricity for 67 million people across 13 states and Washington, D.C. Its unit of account is the megawatt, roughly enough to power 750 homes. And its all-time record, the highest demand it has ever served, is 165,563 megawatts, set during the heat of summer 2006 and untouched for 20 years. 20 years of summers, some of them vicious, and the number never moved. Hold that fact, it is the whole mystery of this story. Now watch the week assemble. A hot weather alert goes up across the entire footprint, running through at least July 3. On June 30, the U.S. Energy Secretary signs 2 emergency orders under the Federal Power Act. The first lets PJM push specified power plants past their normal environmental permit limits. The second authorizes something rarer. As a last resort, PJM may direct data centers and other customers drawing 50 megawatts or more onto their own backup generators within 15 minutes of the signal, with hospitals, 911 centers, water plants, and air traffic control exempt. By July 1, 3 more alerts stack on top: maximum generation, load management, low voltage, and the forecast lands 166,147 megawatts expected for Thursday, July 2. Above the record. On paper. Before the day had even begun, then Thursday came. And Thursday is where this stops being paperwork. Thursday, July 2. Heat indices pass 110 degrees across the mid-Atlantic. The grid is already coming off a historic Wednesday, 161,910 megawatts served on July 1. Preliminarily the second highest load day in its history. Now Thursday climbs past it, toward the record line, peak expected between 5 and 6 in the evening. Then, at the worst possible hour, the jolt. During the evening peak, some generation tripped offline, a sharp, sudden loss of supply at maximum demand. PJM ran its playbook in sequence. Emergency demand response, standby peaker plants called up, and a formal warning to transmission owners to prepare for moving data centers onto backup power. Operating reserves, the grid's real-time safety cushion, fell from roughly 11,000 megawatts to about 5,100. Half the cushion, gone in an evening. And here is the number with the asterisk. Thursday's peak instantaneous load read approximately 162,700 megawatts below the record on the meter. But the meter was being held down, deliberately and by design. Roughly 6,000 megawatts of demand response had been activated. Customers paid to stop consuming. Add that back, and PJM's own bulletin says it plainly: the peak load is likely to have surpassed the all-time record. The official answer arrives after a 60-day accounting of how much demand was actually shaved. The demand was there. Part of it was simply paid to stand down. The market screamed throughout. Wholesale power in the Mid-Atlantic and Dominion zones cleared past $2,500 per megawatt hour against roughly $40 on an ordinary day, driven largely by congestion on overloaded lines. Around PJM, the whole neighborhood strained. New York appealing for conservation, New England exceptionally tight, the Midwest in conservative operations, utilities asking customers to raise thermostats and grill outdoors. And through all of it, one fact held: no rolling blackouts. anywhere, all week. Here is the strange part. Summers have come and gone for 20 years, several of them brutal, and this record never moved. To understand why it moved now, you have to know what froze it in the first place. Start with what PJM actually is, because the name hides the function. PJM owns no power plants. It generates nothing. It is the air traffic control of electricity, a regional transmission organization that coordinates the grid and runs the wholesale markets across its 1-3 state footprint, matching supply to demand second by second. It is the largest machine of its kind in North America. The record it defended this week was set in the legendary heat of summer 2006, back when American electricity demand still grew every year, as reliably as a law of nature. Utilities planned on that law, Wall Street financed on it, and then, quietly, the law broke. For nearly 2 decades, demand went flat. LED bulbs replaced incandescents, appliances sipped where they had gulped. Buildings tightened, heavy industry moved offshore, the economy kept growing, and the meter did not. Records stopped falling for the simplest possible reason: the peak stopped rising. One more definition, because this week leaned on it. Section 202C of the Federal Power Act gives the Energy Secretary emergency authority to order plants run and loads curtailed when grid reliability is at stake. For most of its history, it was a break-glass tool invoked rarely, in genuine crises. So hold the 3 assumptions this grid was living on: a record that never moves, a demand curve that never climbs, an emergency power that never gets used. All 3 expired in the same week. What unfroze a 20-year record? The answer has an address, and it is not on any weather map. What does it take to move a record that stood through 20 summers? Start with the physics of the old peak. For a century, the shape of electricity demand was the shape of human life. It rose with the morning, climbed with the heat, crested near 5 in the afternoon as millions of air conditioners fought the sun, and collapsed at night when the sun gave up. Demand was a mountain, rebuilt daily. The entire grid, every plant, every wire, every market was engineered around the height of that mountain on the hottest afternoon of the year. Now meet the new customer. A data center does not sleep, it does not cool off at sunset, it does not check the weather. It draws its load flat hour after hour, season after season, a slab of demand laid underneath the old mountain. And that is the entire mechanism of this week. In one image, the mountain of July 2 was not taller than the mountains of 2011 or 2012. It was standing on a higher floor. Raise the floor far enough, and an ordinary vicious summer clears a record that legendary summers could not touch. The weather did not break this record, the baseline did. The floor has numbers, and they are not subtle. PJM's own projection: peak demand grows by 32 gigawatts between 2024 and 2030, and all but 2 of those gigawatts come from data centers. Nationally, data centers consumed under 2% of U.S. electricity in 2018, over 4% by 2023, and the national laboratory tracking them projects as much as 12% by 2028, and the epicenter sits inside PJM's own footprint. Northern Virginia, home to the largest concentration of data centers on Earth, the exact zone where this week's prices went vertical. Follow the money and the same signature appears. PJM's capacity auction, the market that pays generators simply to exist and be ready, cleared at $28.92 per megawatt day 3 auctions ago. The latest cleared above $329 a record, up more than 11-fold, pinned against a regulator-approved price ceiling. The Independent Market Monitor attributes 63% of that run-up to data center demand, a tab of roughly $9.3 billion routing to ratepayers. And when the record week came, the machine burned everything in the pantry. Gas supplied 44% of generation at the peak, nuclear 20%, coal 19%, solar 6%. Now, here is the detail that reframes the entire week. Those federal emergency orders, the break glass tool from a moment ago? This was the 3rd time in 2026 that Washington has had to reach for it on PJM's behalf. And across America's grids, the federal government has issued 34 such emergency orders this year. 34 in 6 months for an instrument built for rare crises. The record is a headline, the frequency is a diagnosis. So line up the year, because 2026 has been keeping a ledger. Now, line up the year. January 2026. A cold snap grips the region, and PJM reaches for federal emergency authority, the first invocation of the year. May. A stretch of early heat collides with a heavy maintenance season, and the tool comes out again. And now July, the heat dome, the record, and not one order but two, the Data Center Curtailment Authority, plus, for the first time in this sequence, environmental permit relief for power plants. 3 federal interventions, 1 grid, 6 months. Widen the lens, and the pattern is national. Across America's grid operators, Texas, New England, New York, the Midwest, the Southeast, Puerto Rico, Washington has issued 34 grid emergency orders in 2026. PJM leads the count. To be clear about scale, this is an instrument that was historically reserved for genuine crises, now being issued at a pace of more than 1 per week, somewhere in the country, all year. Now run the headroom math, honestly. Against this week's 166,000 megawatt peak, PJM reported available capacity between roughly 183,000 and 198,000 megawatts, a cushion of somewhere between 10 and 19%. The industry's traditional comfort band is 15 to 20, so the machine is living at the bottom edge of its own historic standard on a peak that grows every single year. And the cushion is thinner than it looks. On an ordinary day, nearly 35,000 megawatts of PJM generation sits offline for maintenance. This week, the June 25 recall squeezed that below 16,000. Translation: the grid had already spent its hidden reserve just getting to the starting line. One more large unit tripping at the peak, and the playbook runs out of quiet pages. Meanwhile, the supply side runs on a slower clock. New power plants wait years in the connection queue. Transformers and turbines carry delivery times measured in years and stretching. And this very week, PJM opened its capacity auction for 2028 and 2029, trading under an emergency price collar imposed precisely because the last auctions went vertical. So hold the two facts of this week side by side. A record assault, 0 blackouts the machine held, 3 federal emergencies in 6 months the machine keeps needing help. Which fact tells the truth about America's largest grid? Let us take the darker reading seriously, and then let us look at what the record actually shows. Here is the most honest version of that fear, the version built entirely from this week's own receipts. Demand just crossed a line that stood for 20 years, and the growth behind it is not speculative, it is contracted, sited, and under construction. The capacity market went up more than 11-fold in 3 auctions, which is a market screaming scarcity in the only language markets have. The safety cushion halved in a single evening because one slice of generation stumbled. A federal emergency instrument built for rare crises now fires, somewhere in America, better than once a week. New supply is trapped in connection queues measured in years, behind transformer and turbine backlogs also measured in years. And the people who study this system for a living say the quiet part on the record, the data centers, in one advocate's words, have pushed this grid to a place where luck matters. Every sentence in that paragraph is a measurement or a quotation. Not one is invented. If you finished this week worried about America's largest grid, you were paying attention. The fear is not fringe. It is arithmetic. Now the verdict in 2 parts, and part 1 is what the machine actually did. Walk the defenses in firing order. Alerts issued a week before the first triple-digit index. Every generator recalled from maintenance before the heat arrived. Maximum generation ordered. 6,000 megawatts of demand response deployed at the peak, an invisible power plant made entirely of paid restraint, generating nothing and saving everything. Exports to neighbors managed in advance. Federal authority loaded, held, and this matters never fired. The last resort curtailment of data centers stayed a warning, not an order. 67 million people kept their lights on at the exact hour the meter maxed. Hold this machine to the standard this channel applied to the typhoon forecast weeks ago, and the conclusion is identical. The system did not trail its storm, it led it by a week. That is not luck. That is procedure executed. Part 2 is where the honesty bites. A 5,100 megawatt cushion under a 163,000 megawatt load is a 3% margin. The playbook worked with almost no room for a second surprise. One more tripped unit at the wrong minute, and this video has a different ending. Luck matters is not this channel's phrase. It is the industry's own, spoken by its own experts, about its own machine. The growth curve is front-loaded against a supply chain that answers in years, which means the squeeze tightens before any relief arrives. The costs are not waiting for some future crisis. Roughly $9 billion in capacity charges is routing to ratepayers now on bills this year. and the rulebook that decides the hardest question of the new era, who gets curtailed first when the megawatts run short, is, as of this month, still being written. The machine held this week under rules designed for the last era. The next era's rules are a committee agenda. So the verdict cuts clean, and it is neither of the headlines. This is not a failing grid. A failing grid does not execute a 7-day playbook flawlessly under a 20-year record. And it is not a comfortable one. A comfortable grid does not need federal emergency powers 3 times in 6 months. What this is, precisely, is a grid whose margin is being consumed faster than it is being rebuilt. Bending, visibly, in public and holding. The same word this channel used over the ocean's heat ledger applies here, at industrial voltage. Margin. It is maintained or it is lost. There is no third option on this machine either. Because to see where this grid is headed, you have to see the shape of the curve that carried it here. Pull back 50 years. Draw American electricity demand as a single line across one lifetime, and it splits into 3 eras. Era 1, the climb. From the post-war years through the turn of the century, demand rose as dependably as the economy itself decade after decade, a staircase with no landings. The country answered by building plants, wires, entire regional machines like PJM, all engineered for a line that only went up. Era 2, the plateau. From the mid-2000s, the line did something no planner's textbook predicted. It went flat, and stayed flat for nearly 20 years. Efficiency quietly ate the growth. The 2006 record fossilized, not because the summer softened, but because the peak stopped climbing. An entire generation of grid planners, traders, and regulators learned their craft on a curve that did not move. Flat became the assumption underneath everything. Era 3, the bend. Data centers, electrification, electric vehicles, and the line turns upward again, steeply. PJM's own 20-year forecast, published this January, puts numbers on the bend that deserve to be read slowly. The summer peak climbing roughly 85,000 megawatts over 15 years to more than 241,000 growth, averaging 3.6% per year over the next decade on a system whose current generating capacity is about 182,000. And winter, historically the quiet season, closing the gap fast, a projected 224,000 megawatt winter peak by 2041 on a grid that set its all-time winter record just last year. The bend is not a forecast quirk. It is the planning baseline now. And 2026 is what the bend looks like as operations. 34 federal grid emergencies in 6 months, from Texas to New England, conservation appeals up and down the seaboard, and America's largest grid crossing a 20-year line in the first week of July. One honest note before the finale. America has rebuilt its grid under pressure before after the great 2003 Northeast blackout and in the post-war build-out that Era 1 demanded. The machine has been re-engineered in living memory. It has simply never done it this fast for this customer. The plateau was the anomaly, and it just ended. Which brings us back to this exact week on the calendar, because the title's second half is the operational one. Summer is not half over. So, where does this leave us? Watching 4 things, and the first is the record itself. PJM's official verdict on July 2 arrives only after a 60-day accounting of the 6,000 megawatts of demand response it deployed at the peak. When that settled number publishes in early September, it decides the headline. Either the 2006 record is formally history, or it technically survived, held up by paid restraint, with true demand above it either way. Read that carefully, because both outcomes mean the same thing. Demand reached a 20-year record's altitude in the first week of July, with most of the summer unspent. This channel will report the settled figure to the megawatt, because precision is the product, but the physics has already voted. Second, the calendar, which is the operational half of this story's title. Hot weather alerts were already extended past the emergency window, and the climatological peak of eastern heat does not arrive until late July and August. Every heat dome between now and September now runs the same playbook you watched this week, as a live, public stress test, each one starting from a floor that only rises. And January's cold snap emergency already proved the exposure runs year-round. This grid no longer has an off-season, it has intermissions. Third, the rulebook. This very month, PJM's board is choosing among proposals for how data centers connect to a strained grid, options running from bring-your-own power plant to almost entirely hands-off with federal regulators approval to follow. That decision, more than any weather system, will determine who gets curtailed first when megawatts run short and who pays for the margin everyone shares. This channel will report the ruling whichever way it lands, and fourth, the market's own forecast. The capacity auction now underway for 2028 and 2029, trading under its emergency price collar, will publish a clearing price, and that price is the market's honest bet on how tight the next era gets. One practical note delivered once. The invisible power plant that helped hold this week's line demand response is open to ordinary customers through most utilities. The grid paid for flexibility this week. It will pay again. So test the title one last time against everything on the table. Did America's largest power grid just break its all-time record? Per the grid's own bulletin, likely pending the meter's final word and by the only measure that matters physically, the demand was there regardless of what the ledger ends up saying. But the record did not fall because America finally got hotter than 2006. Summers as brutal came and went for 2 decades and never came close. Something changed underneath the heat, and now you know its name. It fell because the floor under the heat rose a new, sleepless class of demand stacked beneath the old air conditioning mountain in the first summer of the curve's new era. And summer is not half over. That half of the title needs no asterisk at all. Which leaves the real danger, and it was never this week's peak the playbook handled this week, visibly and in public. The danger is planning the next decade on the plateau's instincts, while the curve, the costs, and the emergency count all say the plateau is over. Margin is the whole game on this machine, exactly as it is on every system this channel covers, consumed or rebuilt, with no third option. So watch for the settled number in September. Watch the next heat dome, run the playbook, watch the board's data center ruling, and the auction's closing price. We will be tracking all of it as it develops.